Welcome to the final panel of the 2020 Presidential Elections Program of Rice University's James A. Baker III Institute of Public Policy. I'm John Williams, co-director of the program. Niels Bohr, the late Danish Nobel laureate in physics, once said, remember he said this not as a pollster, but as a physicist, prediction is very difficult, especially if it's about the future. With that in mind, our top panel of political consultants and observers will engage in crystal ball analysis and predict what we should expect to see in terms of the legislative process in the next 2 or 3 years. And then they will look ahead at the 2024 presidential nomination process, and perhaps we can get them to express a prediction about who the next president will be. Today's panel includes David Carney, President and CEO of Norway Hill Associates, Inc., a New Hampshire-based public relations and communications firm. Prior to founding Norway Hill in 1996, Carney was special assistant to President George H.W. Bush, and he served in 1992 as National Field Director and Director of Political Affairs for the Bush-Quayle re-election campaign. Selena Lake is a leading political strategist who has served as tactician and senior advisor for research on issues such as healthcare, the environment, and education. She and her firm, Lake Research Partners, have worked for the Democratic National Committee, AFL-CIO, Sierra Club, Planned Parenthood, among several other institutions. Amy Walter is national editor of the Cook Political Report, where she provides analysis on the issues and trends that shape our political environment. With more than 25 years of experience, Amy has a well-deserved reputation as an accurate, objective, and insightful political analysis with unparalleled access to campaign insiders and decision makers. Today's discussion will be moderated by Michael Nelson, our old friend, the former professor of political science at Rhodes College and a senior fellow at the University of Virginia's Miller Center. According to a survey of college courses on the American presidency, 2 of Nelson's books on the presidency rank among the top 5 most frequently studied. Thank you for joining us. Mike, take it away.
Thank you, John. And what a great pleasure it is to be with such a distinguished group of political veterans and political analysts. And we're going to need all their expertise to get us from here going forward. Typically at this time after an election, we would be talking about January 20th as the next important date on the calendar, because that's when the new president would take office. But this is the year in which going forward means making several stops along the way between what happened a month ago today, which we used to call Election Day, back when most things happened on one day, and with days to go between now and the inauguration. What's going to happen between now and then in order to get us to the point where the next term of the next president actually begins? And are there pitfalls along the way between here and there? Dave, you want to kick us off with that?
Yeah, I think, this is an unusual circumstance, which is not, I don't predictive of the future, or, I think the entire, Trump years have been, unpredictable, non-traditional, unexpected. And I don't think this is really any different than what's taken place since, he announced his presidency coming down the escalator. But I do think there are certain, fundamental structural reforms that some of the states should consider. I mean, California and Illinois and New York did not actually finish counting ballots until last week. Nothing to do with controversy or, allegations of anything. Just that's their normal process. And I think that is fundamentally a flawed system when other states who have millions of voters, are able to count their votes on election day and evening. Texas, for example, had more votes than New York or Illinois, and 3 weeks of early voting were able to get, almost 12 million ballots counted, on election day. And I think that reassures people. The problem with issues with the election, it undercuts the credibility of the government. It gives people pause, and therefore the credibility of the things the government does and says gets undermined. And our whole system of governance is that the people elect our officials, and we give them our trust. And all of these structural things where people can mail ballots days after in some states a few days after the election and still count. Those things are really undermine what we need is a democracy and a republic to have confidence in our systems. I hope this whole episode gets some serious, the states to seriously look at putting in some reforms that make it easier and more confidence in the system where they all get counted within a very short window.
Is there any uncertainty in any of your minds about the steps along the way between now and January 20th? I mean, states do have to certify their ballots. The electors do have to meet. Congress has to gather and receive the ballots and entertain any objections outside of the formal process. There's worries about, among some at least, among violent demonstrations of various kinds. Are these all sort of fanciful concerns, or are any of you thinking that the road may be bumpy between now and the 20th of January?
I mean, look, the road has been bumpy. The fact is, this election was over a long time ago, and the President of the United States, it doesn't matter if he concedes or not. There's nothing in the Constitution that said the president needs to concede. He has every right to go and say, I'm going to take legal remedy where I feel like the state has wronged voters somehow. What's not okay is to disparage the entire process. And look, we don't know if this is just going to be a short-term sort of, well, that was Trump and I still trust the process. I just don't trust certain people. But I have to say, I covered the election process. I spent a lot of time talking to election officials across the country, especially in these battleground states. And it is true that each state has different rules. Each state has different, some of it legislative, some of it by executive authority, rules and regulations about how and when they process this information. Some states, as we know, like Texas, like Florida, like Arizona, they've been doing vote by mail for a long time, or early vote for a long time. They're more comfortable with it than, say, a state like Wisconsin or Pennsylvania, which was brand new. None of that should be particularly controversial. None of that should be surprising. Of course, there are bumps along the way in any process like this. Where it becomes problematic is when people decide that there is something nefarious about this. Part of the reason, and it's become obviously incredibly polarized and very political, part of the reason it took a long time for Pennsylvania to finally declare a winner in that state is that the Republican legislature said, we are not going to change the law that says you can start processing ballots early before Election Day. That meant we knew it. We knew it was going to take a long time in Pennsylvania. We knew that the process itself had been debated in the legislature in Pennsylvania. A bipartisan law was passed that opened the first time in Pennsylvania history where they could vote without having no excuse voting. So there was a lot of work that was done before this election. I think Trump poisoned the well. I don't know for how long. That said, it is also very important to note that secretaries of state across the political spectrum, local officials across the political spectrum, judges across the political spectrum have all sort of stood in the breach and said, look, you can't just say we're going to redo this election. We can't just decide that this election was unfair because you didn't think it was fair. We have to have evidence. We can weigh that evidence. We can do recounts. We can canvass. And when we come up with an answer, as all of these states and institutions have, that is not to your liking, you have to accept that. And so I think at the end of the day, what we'll see, maybe the president doesn't show up to the inaugural. I don't know that I don't even know what the inaugural is going to look like given the state of COVID. I don't know that it's going to matter all that much. What I do worry about, and I think we all should be worried about, is if we do fundamentally have a country which, when half the folks believe that the election was rigged and stolen, and the other half believes that it wasn't. And I don't know where we go from here, Michael. Maybe, again, this is one of those short-term things. As Dave said, we have been living through this era of Trump for 4 years. And so, we kind of go back to a different place with the new president. But it is possible that, we turned a corner and we're not coming back.
Michael, if I can add, and having had the privilege of being on the Biden team as one of their two major pollsters since March of 2019, I think there are three other things that are going on. I really underscore what Amy said. I think people are tired of the election. Even people in Georgia are tired of the election. Democrats and Republicans want to move on. This is the country of, the 6-second instant oatmeal. This is not a country with a lot of patience, not a great desire to look back. They always want to move forward. It's not like we're short of problems. COVID is raging. The economy is in deep trouble. Race relations, climate change. People have lots of things to be concerned about, and they are concerned about them. And they want their elected officials to work together. I think we passed a major milestone when the transition started. And you're going to see the Biden administration have a very, very proactive transition period where they're very clear about what they want to accomplish and who's going to be in charge of that. And you have now a third of the Trump voters who trust the local elected officials over Trump, which is major. And you have a third of the Trump voters. And Amy was right, it's very polarized, but we've hit a turning point where a third of the Trump voters say it's time for Trump to accept the results, not concede necessarily, but accept the results. And the nice thing is, in the last 2 weeks, we've also got a solid majority of the voters who believe, even if there was fraud, that it would not have changed the outcome. So people are moving on. And that is deeply rooted in our culture. It is accentuated by the problems that we have now. And I think both parties, I mean, I'm amazed at the number of senators from Liz Cheney on who are expressing a desire to move on as well.
Dave, do you agree that Republicans are beginning to accept, or at least acknowledge, the results of this election, and that by the time we get to the inauguration, that people will be at a minimum to the fact that Joe Biden is going to be president for the next 4 years?
Well, I don't have any empirical data, but I think most, I think Republicans understand that this is what is probably going to happen, basically because there's been no evidence to show that, somehow you're going to flip Wisconsin or Georgia or something. I think I would say a majority of Republicans are very disappointed in the process and think that there is fraud. Of course, we've always had fraud in elections, particularly at the local level. But, in order to affect the outcome, I don't think that is really, I think people have accepted that. Maybe they wouldn't say it publicly, but I don't think anybody's expecting Donald Trump will be getting inaugurated on January 20th. But I do think they really believe that, that just, not looking at these, not giving it a fair shake or giving him a fair shake. And I don't think that's going to be resolved with, ceremonies on the 20th. I don't think the country is going to get united. And every time Biden does something that is out of step with the majority of the country, they're going to they're going to end up calling him a illegitimate president, the hardcore partisans, because, there wasn't the transparency. There were these spectacularly unexplainable events that took place during that process Tuesday moving on that nobody can explain. And somebody could explain it, but no one has explained it. Mm-hmm. And so I think that, like the, Fulton County absentee military ballots, 900 of them all went for Biden. There wasn't one military ballot for Trump. Now, if that isn't the fact, that's what's been put out there. But if that's not the fact, it's up to the Fulton County officials to point out, no, 40% voted for Trump. That's just not, that's false news. So I think the ignore it, Trump, ignore any of the concerns of the Republicans that Trump brought up is just going to continue to have a, polarized electorate. And, and when the president-elect, when Joe Biden is putting forward things that the country supports, I mean, they'll be for it. But this is not going to go away. It's always going to be a talking point. I think that when everybody runs for president in 24, they're all going to talk about this, and we can't let this happen again, things like that. But it's just, it is going to undermine, the credibility when you don't agree with what the Biden administration may be doing to basically point that out that, he's not a real, he got there under false, unusual, questionable circumstances.
I guess it's
Well,
worth. Go ahead.
so I
Selena.
have to just add here that, and Dave, I have been on with you before and been working against you and working with you, and have deep respect from both perspectives. Nobody's been more articulate than the Georgia electoral establishment. The Georgia Secretary of State, Republican. The Georgia governor, Republican. The Fulton County commissioners, bipartisan. They have all said, this is all false news. They have been outraged. And a lot of local elected officials who both parties, who really dedicated public servants, really work hard to do their elections, are pretty insulted that their hard work is being undermined in this way, because democracy is at stake and the voice of the voters is at stake. But, you said something that I think is very interesting and I don't want to have lost. One of the strongest things we find in our data is the bipartisan consensus around reform. And there is a real appetite. It is ridiculous, the counting. And as Amy suggested and you suggested, people want new voting machines. Democrats are very eager for reform that would make it easier for people to vote. So there is a bipartisan, almost everybody, and particularly independents, wants to get big money out of politics. And so there's really the ability to have a united consensus here on reform. HR 1 was the first bill that the Democrats put up 2 years ago, a reform measure. I hope it'll get revised and expanded, and I hope it'll move bipartisanly, because that's where the voters are.
Well, it might be worth noting.
Local officials, election officials, have one of the most thankless jobs, other than being a school board member, in our federal system. But in Georgia, they have been out there, the Secretary of State, particularly, and his staff, talking. But when the specific charge gets made that Fulton County had 900 military overseas ballots and 900 of them went for Biden, now that's either true or not true. And that would be an easy thing to sort of dispel these controversies. And you can't go down every rabbit trail, because a lot of the controversies, there's no facts to dispute. But where there is a specific fact, I just think it would behoove us all for there to either confirm that is true and that's how those military people voted, or that isn't true. And I think that these unanswerable questions, I think if some of them could be answered, I think people would feel better on our side.
Well, I want us to move on, but it might be worth noting as a matter of history that the last time we had an election like this, where there was ongoing debate over the results in 2000, one of the outcomes of that was the appointment of a commission co-chaired by Secretary Baker that did a pretty thoroughgoing study of the voting process. And clearly things like early voting and mail voting are not going to go away with the vaccine. So figuring out how to process those votes in a way that people respect as fair might be something that can happen again. I do want to address or ask you all to address the kind of question we would be asking after a sort of ordinary election looking forward, and that is, which party won this election? That's a matter of some confusion, because we didn't have a sort of top to bottom clear verdict from the voters this year. And I wonder, coming out of this election, which party thinks it has a mandate, or do both parties think they have some sort of mandate? Amy, you're You're no better to address that than you.
Try to be there. I've been saying the same thing, Michael, because, part of the reason that I think a lot of folks like elections, or folks like me like to cover elections, is because at the end of the day, you have an answer, right? We have all these theories out there and both sides are presenting their arguments and messages, but guess what? Someone's going to win and someone's going to lose. And so someone's theory and plan worked and the other side didn't. In this case, you're right. It was both a referendum on Trump, but it was not a referendum on the Republican Party. So, if you're Republicans, you're feeling that, okay, not happy to lose the White House. At the same time, they didn't lose one House incumbent, and only lost 2 Senate seats at this point, while we're waiting on Georgia for the final. And so it was sort of saying, we don't like the Trump himself, but they were also not punishing Republicans for embracing parts of Trumpism, either so standing by him, as many senators and members of Congress did, or even those who did not, were criticized by many for not standing up to him. Just while they may not have embraced him, they also sort of just kept their head down and tried not to do much there. So I do think it gave something of a mixed message, but at the end of the day, the mandate seems to be, guess what? We just don't like extremes on either side, right? So the argument that Republicans put forward is, you let Democrats get in charge and they're going to move this country so far to the left, over to the extremes with socialism, et cetera. You're not going to recognize this country. Now, that didn't work against Joe Biden because, quite frankly, people know who Joe Biden is, and it doesn't make much sense. But the idea that this is the country, or that this race was a fight, an existential fight for America, I do think is what played out here. And if you fundamentally believe that Donald Trump was dangerous to the country, dangerous for democracy, whether or not you agreed with any of his policies didn't matter. You were voting against him. If you believed that having Democrats in charge meant that they are going to fundamentally alter the fabric of American society, whether that means they're truly going to bring socialism to America, or they're going to engage in this sort of PC cancel culture, right? Erasing history, then you voted for Donald Trump. And that existential fight, what we're going to see, I'm sure we're going to talk about in a little bit, Michael, whether this continues post-Trump. Does anybody sort of tap into that in the way that Trump did? I do feel like this was an election that was really processed in our animal brain, not in our human frontal lobe part, where it was incredibly emotional, incredibly reactive. And so everything for these last 4 years has gone through the filter of Donald Trump. Whatever it was, does Trump like it? Great, I like it. Does Trump like it? Great, I hate it, right? The actual intricacies of that policy were less important than whether Trump was supportive or not supportive of it. So you're right. We get an election where, on the one hand, you have Joe Biden winning handily, right? It was not very close. He wins by about 7 million votes, 306 electoral college votes, and yet, these states that won the election for him, Wisconsin, Georgia, Arizona, that was decided by about 42,000 votes. Had those gone the other way, we would have had a 269 to 269 tie, which would have been, oh my God, if you think we're in drama now, just imagine that going to the House. At the same time, you have Trump getting the second most votes in history, and yet he moved his overall national vote from 46% to 46.9%, right? That's it. He didn't hit 50% of the vote in half of the states. He didn't get 50% of the vote in 2016. So he only moved his margin in Michigan by half a point. Pennsylvania, he moved his margin by a sixth of a point. In Arizona by 1 point from 2016. So you think about it, we have all this drama, incredible turnout, incredible tumult. And yet really what we had was an election that was fought out on the edges.
So Linda, are there any particular lessons that Democrats should take from what happened down ballot? You know, winning the presidency clearly is an accomplishment, but is there anything that should be concerning to Democrats in terms of how things turned out in elections below the White House?
I think there are a lot of things to take away as lessons. One thing to take away as lesson is that I think a lot of this was a referendum on Trump and through the prism of Trump. And as much as, and there's nobody like Trump in people's minds. So as much as we wanted to say that these senators, these House people went along with him 100%. I mean, even when we were testing it in the polling to say, you know, Steve Daines voted with him 96% of the time, people just thought Steve Daines is a really different personality than Donald Trump. And people just didn't buy it, even when it was honestly true. The second thing I think is that we really need to pay attention to the distribution of the seats, so that most of those House seats that we lost had been won by Trump in 2016 and 2020. Same thing for the Senate seats. There were a couple of exceptions, Susan Collins being an obvious exception, but so this was tough terrain, and part of it was the distribution of the seats in a very, very polarized environment. The third lesson that I think Democrats have to learn is Trump in particular, but Republicans in general, have their turnout operation, and we need to be more respectful of it. There was a real surge in registration of white non-college educated voters at the end. They had door to door where, because of COVID, we were not able to have it. They were helped in states like Montana and Wisconsin that have same day registrations. So they had their surge, we had our surge, and both sides are fighting for turnout. And we often, I think, I think the pollsters in particular underestimated the white non-college surge in some of these places. And then the last thing I think is Hillary Clinton ran one ad on the economy. Joe Biden ran 40% of his traffic on the economy. But that didn't, and he really battled for credibility against a businessman with a lot of credibility on the economy to provide an economic alternative. But as a party, we're still way behind on the economy. People are not going to elect Democrats unless they're good on the economy, particularly when it's the number one issue. So I think one of the lessons going forward is that we as a party led by Joe Biden and Vice President Harris need to establish a strong, robust, muscular economic policy and identity. And Democrats aren't going to get elected massively across the board until we have one.
David, same question to you, only for Republicans. What should Republicans take away from this election in terms of how to proceed going forward? Should Trumpism be preserved even in the absence of Trump, or is there something more strategic that needs to occur?
Well, you know, I probably have a very unorthodox point of view on this, and that is that you know, I really don't think the country voters really care much about what goes on in Washington. Nothing happens in Washington. It's just that it's impossible to get anything done there other than name some post office. It just states is where the action is. And I think when people are looking at their quality of life, in the economy, dealing with COVID, you know, education, things that are important to their daily lives, I think they look at the state levels. And, you know, clearly, you know, we had an extreme success across the board on winning at the local level, the state legislative level in particular, where we had unprecedented amount, I mean, hundreds of millions of dollars spent on, national left groups on the left trying to take over legislatures. And their argument was redistricting, which is, I mean, I always learned in politics that when you're talking about process, no one cares. I mean, I bet most people don't even know what redistricting is or why it's important. And so, you know, we need to, you know, our party needs to continue to talk about the bread and butter issues. And, you know, clearly we did very well. And in the national level, I think that, you know, the PPP and the early on COVID stuff was very popular. And I worked on the Susan Collins race, and that was she was one of the co-author, built that provision into the first few COVID packages. And that was a huge godsend to a small state like Maine. And that get replicated all across the country, that small business people got their $45,000 loan or whatever it was, and they were able to keep their employees and pay their rent and, survive. Basically, that was very, very popular. And I think the senators that took advantage of that, did well. But, I think that data shows that most people had made up their mind by September on the presidential race. We spent $500 million September and October, really didn't move the needle that much. And Selena's made a very good point. I mean, the Democrats spent millions, 180 million overall, but millions of dollars trying to convince people in Maine that Susan Collins was a puppet of Donald Trump. I mean, Susan Collins and Donald Trump could not be more different. If you went to a laboratory and created two totally different creatures, they're totally separate. And they're spending money on trying to demonize someone like Susan Collins that she's Trump, I just think felt on, deaf ears where people knew for in fact, they've known her for 24 years and, she's anything but Trump. So there were a lot of strategic mistakes. I will say, honestly, Michael, that the Kenosha riots, and I said this when I was asked about it, I think the Kenosha riots really set the tone for what was going on at the local legislative level, at the local level. Portland and Seattle can burn down. Most people in flyover country, don't care because they've always been crazy. They always have a reputation of being far out there. But when a city in middle America of 100,000 people, where our people all know a city, live near a city, in a city of 100,000 people, where all these businesses were destroyed, where people know business people, they work at small business. 80% of the people in these small states who work in the private sector work for small business. To see them totally destroyed like that, well, that could happen anywhere in America. And I think that whole defund the police and all that's more than the new Green Deal and some of the other, left things that were out there. I think the defund the police movement was instrumental in ensuring that Republicans at the legislative level and the state level. I mean, every Republican governor won, and we picked up a governorship. I mean, that in Montana. So I think there were some things out of the control. Democrats didn't do Kenosha. That was not in their control. But I think that helped set the narrative that this isn't just a crazy city problem. This is the town that you go shopping in problem. And I think that scared people. And I think that the ability of our campaigns to just not be tied in the national discussion, which is I really believe that people think things get fixed in their state capital, and that they don't hold hope that Washington is going to be saving the day. And maybe with a vaccine and more COVID PPP and education funding, that could change a little bit. But right now, at least on our side, our folks don't look as if Washington is the answer. They don't really want to ask the question. They want to get action at the local and city and county level, but particularly state capitals.
I think that Dave's raising a really important point too, because as most people know on this call, that we are going to have a record number of governors' races, AGs, et cetera, in 2022. So we shouldn't what happens federally may be frankly less important than what happens at the state level. Two comments that I want to make. One thing that I want to credit the Republicans for that Dave didn't mention is they finally figured out that they should nominate women. Now, what was disappointing to feminists like myself is they found a lot of really right-wing women, but they won with women. And they had really been behind the 8 ball in 2018 because they didn't nominate women, and they fixed that. And Susan Collins is, not only a moderate, but she's part of their leading women strategy that's very, very effective. The one thing I want to make, I think defund the police is an example. I think the wrong lesson is being taken from defund the police, but I think it is a vivid example of the Republicans and Donald Trump using the bully pulpit to name an issue and define an issue, and us being late to the game. So 2/3 of Americans oppose defund the police, but half of Americans believe that defund the police doesn't really mean defund the police. It means reprioritize. And Americans are very interested in police reform. but we let the label stick of defund the police. We didn't define it. And there are lots of, Creepy Joe, Sleepy Joe, all these memes. We were behind in these social media strategies, and the Republicans pick these labels to find these issues quickly. They really target very effectively, and we're very, very often slow in catching up, and we pay a real price for it. I think the Biden campaign put together a phenomenal operation. By the end was really catching up on the disinformation piece, but we were way behind for a lot of the campaign, and then our state and local races even further behind. So that's a page we got to take out of the Republican playbook and get better at.
I agree with you on the reform part.
Let me turn to Amy
Repub-
here, so we can move on. And
Sure.
that is, after, there have been times when a party has lost an election, Democrats after losing 84 and then forming the Democratic Leadership Council and so on, the Republicans after 2012 and doing that sort of self-study. Is this an occasion when either or both parties going forward with 2022 in mind, with 2024 in mind, but also with coming decades in mind, would either party benefit from doing a kind of intense self-study about how to start appealing to voters that they're not appealing to now?
I don't think there's such thing anymore, Michael, as a institution that speaks for one party or the other. I even think that the DNC and the RNC, they still are important parts of the party apparatus, but they don't sort of hold the same sway that they once did, or have the same impact as they once did. Just like our national media climate has become so much more diffused, people getting information from all kinds of sources, the parties are getting money and advice and candidates and infrastructure help from all kinds of places. So there is really no center anymore. And I think you're going to see, just like you did after 2016, you're going to see a lot of different opinions come up about what the party should do, how they should fix it. This part of this group thinks this group thinks this group thinks this. Remember, after the 2016 election, the fight among Democrats was, or at least the way it was being portrayed was, okay, the candidate we need in 2020 is one who can turn out our base, right? Forget about winning back all those Obama, Trump voters or those white working class people. We're never going to get them back. Forget about them. Go and turn out all those young voters of color. That's how we win. And then you had the other part of the Democratic Party saying that's absolutely ridiculous. We need to win some of these people back. We can't just count on a turnout operation, right? This was the back and forth. Nobody really had a monopoly on that. And they let the voters in the Democratic primary decide who the best candidate would be to face up against Donald Trump. And they picked the candidate that most folks in Washington thought was never going to make it, especially after they watched him in Iowa and New Hampshire and thought, like, this guy, come on, he's not going to be able to make it all the way. So I think if we've learned anything, it's that these institutions and the sort of concept of the party deciding, those days are pretty much gone. Donald Trump buried it in 2016, and then Joe Biden on the Republican side, and Joe Biden kind of buried it in 2020.
Dave, I wonder, you were involved heavily, obviously, in the 1992 presidential campaign, but that was also an election in which Georgia ended up having a runoff election. Now, I don't think the stakes were terribly high then in terms of control of the Senate, but what do you see as at stake in these two runoff elections in Georgia, which are going to be occurring, 5 weeks from today?
Well, I thought the Georgia runoffs in '92 were extremely important because I got a job. Rich Bond hired me to be the political director of the RNC and gave me a big checkbook. And I spent 4 weeks in Georgia helping Paul Coverdale, who has passed away, but was a great American and had been a huge Bush supporter and had been with the Peace Corps, his director of the Peace Corps. And, was sort of our last gasp to make sure that Paul won, and that was a great race. I think because the Senate, will be at 50 or 52 or, tied or 51, depending on how this works, it is more important than, any runoff we've had in our country's history, most likely. because it will be the difference between, you know, serious gridlock and only things passing are, compromise, which I think, sometimes is a good thing, or nothing happening. And I think that, and making this a 2 years of, really, really difficult to do anything in Washington. And it will be interesting to see, are there, Purdue, whatever the Reverend's voters. I mean, Warlock. Yeah, are voters in Georgia going to vote for a Republican and a Democrat, or vote for, they split their ticket? And I don't know. I would think that maybe some, but I think this is going to go 0 for 2 for the Republicans, or 2 for 0, one way or the other. And we're going to once again prove, if we needed the proof, that big money doesn't matter. I mean, they're going to spend $1 billion, maybe close to $1 billion before this is over. And, we'll prove that there is a limit to the effectiveness of money, and it will really be about message and turnout and mobilization. And, I do think the biggest damage from all of this controversy over the election is going to be, will Republicans have confidence to go vote? And undermining that confidence amongst the right of center voters is really hurtful to the president, because a Democrat Senate will undo his legacy at every opportunity they get. And, the Trump world spent a year maligning absentee mail-in ballots. Well, quite honestly, that's how we win elections on our side, with Republican seniors voting by mail. We spend money to send them the applications. We send money to chase the applications. We send money to focus and get people. We send people door to door to seniors to make sure they send their ballot in. And it's been a reliable source of a huge number of votes across the country. And when the campaign and the RNC and the president, all these people are trashing mail-in votes, we saw this in California. I did a lot of work in California this year, where you talking to Republicans on the phone trying to get in. Nope, I'm not sending my ballot in. I'm going in person. And it just makes for, long lines, nowhere to park. They go home, they forget, whatever the reason is. A mail-in ballot is so much more reliable vote if you could keep the ways you can monkey around with it, with the mail-in voting. And so I think this election will be all about turnout. I think it will be, every single person in Georgia will stop answering their phone and stop answering the door, and Netflix will get huge bump in viewership, in the next 5 weeks. I think people are just sick of politics. And I don't think there's probably a single voter who needs to be convinced that that Purdue or Warlock are better. I think it's a matter of getting his base out, or their, on the Democrat side, or getting our base out on the Republican side. And the individual swing voters that do exist, on the margins. But this is going to be a massive turnout operation. We do have, I know our side has invested a lot of money in volunteers and field program, and we'll have thousands of people on the street. But I don't know, by the week of Christmas, if people are going to be too enthusiastic to answer their door or their phone.
Thank you. Selena, I'm interested in what you think is going to happen in Georgia, but I also wonder what are the stakes? In other words, what difference does it make for Joe Biden and his administration's capacity to make a mark on public policy? How much is that contingent on what happens in these two Georgia elections and with control of the Senate at stake?
Well, I think that it's, I think it's too close to call, and all of the polls show that it's dead even. There's a little bit of difference between the Warnock and Ossoff vote, but not a whole lot. I think our secret weapon, of course, is fair vote and Stacey Abrams. And my own view of it is we won Georgia for Joe Biden in large part because of the work that those folks did. And as much as we're going to dump national resources and national money and national TV in there, and I agree with you, Dave, buy Netflix stock, buy satellite dish stock, because people are going to be sick of it looking for those Christmas specials. But I think that that operation is still going to make a huge, huge difference. That said, you do have, we did narrowly win Georgia, and in the end, what we're asking ourselves is, are we going to have Biden Purdue voters or Biden Loeffler voters? And boy, that's interesting. That's a real cross-pressured voter. I think that it's probably easier to govern, obviously, if we have a majority of the Senate, but the idea that we're going to take over the Senate when you're at 50-50, and you've got, we've got some conservative members in our coalition, and we have some people like Lisa Murkowski, and I hope Susan Collins will join, but and some others and Sass and Romney and some others who really want to work together. So in some ways it may make less difference for, frankly, I think it makes less difference for Joe Biden and more difference for Mitch McConnell, because of the role that he can play. But I think Joe Biden is intent, and Joe Biden believes more than anybody in this country in the power of being able to bring senators together and work together for compromise, and not to let the best get in the way of the good. And I think he's going to move forward. And there's just a lot that needs to happen that has become sadly ideological under the Trump administration. I mean, really, you have to wear shoes to go into a restaurant. Why did it become a political battleground about whether you're going to wear a mask? That's just really sad for the country. And is it a political issue about whether a nurse is going to have PPE? Is it a political issue about whether a small business is going to be able to get a second loan? Is it a political issue if you just lost your job, whether you need unemployment? Is it a political issue about we got to protect our teachers, but our kids are paying a really high price with this distant learning, and we've at least got to get the little ones and our disabled children back to school? These are not partisan issues, I hope. And I know one person who's really committed to thinking that they're not partisan issues is Joe Biden.
Amy, your thoughts on Georgia and the significance of what happens there?
I agree with my distinguished colleagues here on this. And look, I want to be optimistic, as Celinda is, about both the fact that, Biden is a creature of the Senate. He loves the Senate. He loves Congress. That wasn't true of our previous two presidents. Barack Obama was famously very, shall we say, cool to members of Congress, including members of his own party, who would complain to me all the time that they didn't get the sort of feeding and care that they thought they deserved from the president of, especially one of their own party. So to have somebody come in who says, not only am I committed to working with Congress, but I love this place and I understand this place, I think is helpful. I think it's helpful that he is already committed to turning down the heat. It's not like he's going to be able to get rid of polarization. No president can. Trump didn't invent it, and it had been there already. But I think you can decide whether you want to turn up the volume or whether you want to put it down. And I think that he's already been doing that. To me, the question is this: it seems like we have a problem that is not so much about politics, but politics is just a victim of it, much like everything else. Like, politics is just a reflection of our society's values, and what's happening writ large. And what's happening writ large, and it's how this conversation started, right? About what information are we getting about this election? Where are you getting it from? How can you trust what you're getting? How do we know these things to be the case? And we have now, whether it's algorithms that determine what shows up on this thing, whether it's whatever you're turning on your television, the people who you are the closest with, who are texting you and sending you emails all the time, those are determining how you view the world. That's not something that a president can overnight, make sort of fix. And I do think that the bigger challenge is when you have algorithms and business models that are really driven to keeping us angry and to keeping us divided and to keeping us enraged all the time. It's just cable news is just an outrage machine. That's its entire job. I don't care which channel you're watching. Its whole job is to make you say, can you believe this? To turn to the person next to you. Can you believe this? Can you believe they're doing this? That is its entire entity. And so how do you How do you do anything in this moment? How do you govern at that time? And the incentive structure is problematic too. You don't get rewarded for doing the right thing. You don't get rewarded for being a compromiser. Most of the folks who've been defeated in these last 10 years or so, they were either moderate compromising type people on the Democratic Party or moderate compromising type people on the Republican side. And so we are left with now incredibly dug in partisans who are rewarded by clicks on this thing, by money that's going into their campaign coffers, by being as outrageous as possible. And so trying to push against that incentive structure is going to be a challenge for anybody. But I agree with Celinda that, when you have a very closely divided Senate, whether it's 50-50 or 52-48, 6 people, right? You put a Joe Manchin, you put the Murkowski, Collins, Romney, Sass, put the 2 Democrats from Arizona, Mark Kelly and Kirsten Sinema, you put them in a room, and then some other Democrats who sort of are on that periphery of the problem solvers caucus or whatever it's called, the Mark Warners of the world, et cetera. You put all those folks in a room, 6-7 people actually can make a big difference in a Senate that is as closely divided as this. But to Celinda's point, a lot of it too determined by which one is the majority leader and how much leeway they're going to give these, whatever we're going to call this caucus, to actually set the agenda.
Let me introduce a new subject that got a lot of attention, a lot of excitement over the summer, but I'm not sure that level of excitement and interest has been maintained. And that we have a new vice president elect, and I wonder, Kamala Harris is widely noted, celebrated that she was a historical first along multiple dimensions. It was also widely noted that she would be serving as vice president in the administration of a president who will turn age 82 before the term is over. I wonder what you all think. This is apart from the fact that she might be the 51st senator in a 50-50 Senate, depending on what happens in Georgia. But I wonder, going forward, do you think that that the Harris vice presidency is going to have some unusual features to it because of her distinctive identity and because of the fact that there will at least be ongoing speculation about whether the Biden presidency will be voluntarily a one-term presidency, opening up the Democratic nomination 4 years from now. So, Linda, you get first dibs on this as the Democrat on the panel.
Well, first of all, let me say that, and I often said this during the campaign, the second best job in America, and maybe the first best job in America, is to be Joe Biden's vice president. Because you want to talk about a man who, 1, had a very big role and relished it, 2, believes in a very big role. And there is a real synergy there. And that synergy started when Attorney General Harris was one of the best friends of Beau Biden, Attorney General. So this is a team that's going to be really exciting. When you say it's kind of receded a little bit, not for the Democrats, it hasn't. There are a lot of women and people of color and young people in the Democratic Party who remain super excited about Harris. And I think that she has the ability to really be a very, very strong voice on some really important debates like this, defund the police, and really craft some new and terrain for us and a new voice. So, and she's been very, very active already in terms of equity and disparity in the distribution of the vaccine. And, most Democrats say, I want to take the vaccine if Anthony Fauci tells me to. Except for African Americans who say, I don't want to take the vaccine, period, because I don't want to be experimented on again. And Senator Harris, Vice President-elect Harris, very, very powerful voice in terms of saying, no, this is reassuring. These are, this has been tested. They're not experiment in this administration. This is not Tuskegee too. So I think that it's a really big role. That she will play a really big role. I think 4 years or 8 years, and I think there's plenty of time in 8 years. She's going to be a leader in that time, and she will be a leader. She will be an inspiration to young boys and girls in both parties. I think that the sky's the limit, honestly, in that role, independent of how long she's vice president. She's going to be a big force.
Say 4 years or 8 years, but that might be of significance. You just have to wonder: is there a built-in fault line? Is there a built-in source of tension between a president, and not just the president, maybe even primarily not the president, but the people around the president and vice president's people? As the question is, well, is the vice president really have her eyes on the next presidential election, or is the vice president really thinking entirely in terms of how can I help the president? Dave, you saw George Bush as a second-term vice president for Ronald Reagan. Celinda, you saw Al Gore as a second-term vice president for Bill Clinton. There, it was clear that the president was not going to be running again. Now it's a question mark, and I just wonder if the level of tension isn't so embedded in the situation that even sort of goodwill and good intentions to.
Well, let me say this though. I mean, I think your example's an ample one. I'll leave to Dave. I don't know how the Bush Reagan thing really worked, except what I observed, read in school, frankly. But I do know the Gore Clinton thing, and there was not tension. And in fact, that team worked really well, and that team was mutually committed to each other. And you'll remember the second term, there was a lot of controversy around President Clinton, and that still was a very strong team. We had a byword in the campaign, during the campaign, once we had a VP nominee. It was one team. We're one team. And that was really an ideology. That was really a mantra that was deeply enforced. And I think this is one team. I also think, particularly with Vice President Biden, who I think sees himself as a transitional leader, as he described himself. There's always politics, and I don't want to be naive about that, but I think this is a president-elect who deeply, in every molecule of his body and his soul, believes that the future of the country is at stake. This is about a lot more than the next campaign. And I think that's going to be a very good orientation. This is not going to be a president who's constantly worried about the next campaign. This is going to be a president worried about the next day for all Americans, whether you voted for him or not. And that is deeply embedded in his psyche and very powerful to the public. And the vice president-elect is going to adopt that same mantra. So Clinton and Gore is a great model because they were a team. This is a team that has as their motto, one team. And this is a situation where I think they're both focused on what's good for all Americans, voted for me or not.
Dave, do you think the Harris vice presidency makes the office of distinctive interest, unusual interest for the next 4 years?
It all depends what the president wants the vice president to do. And, there were definitely tensions in the second Bush-Reagan term because, and that was a personality thing, that Mrs. Reagan wasn't the biggest fan of Vice President Bush. So it made for awkward times throughout the last term. I think the President Biden is going to be a one-term president, not for any bad things, hopefully, but just because of his age and things like that, and he said this a number of times about being a transformational presidency. And I think that the opportunity for Harris is great, but obviously the one thing about being the vice president is if things don't go well in the first couple of years and the economy doesn't come back or there are other issues, she will be tagged with that when she runs. I'm not sure that I don't know the Democratic politics very well, but I don't know that she would get a layup and everyone give if President Biden did not seek re-election, and that would let him do that. What Selena said, I'm about the country, and I'm not about reelection, and focus every day until the 19th of January on that. But I don't know that the other Democratic leaders would not consider running against her if she were, she would be the front runner clearly. And it will all be perfect in the beginning. All be a lot of great words, and she's in my room all the time. She's the last person I talked to before making decisions. All that stuff is true. And the question is what really happens, because vice presidency, no matter who they are, no matter what they say, they don't like to get upstaged. And obviously Biden is not a grandstander, at least recently. He's not going to, I think, be a grandstander. And be careful. The Biden team, the Biden-Harris team, the Harris people are going to be somewhat conscientious about not trying to upstage the president. And if she's stuck in the Senate all the time, having to preside and cast votes, it really does limit her ability to go out in the countryside and fly around the country and build relationships. So time will tell. And there's been dozens of different models for every president and vice president team. There's really been a separate model, and I'm sure that president having been vice president, he knows the good parts and the bad parts. You don't want to spend your whole 4 years flying around to foreign leader funerals and not being, in the action, what's going on in the Oval Office. So it will be very interesting to see, but it will start off great. The question is what happens, in a year and a half when the glow is over and midterm elections happen. She's going to have to go campaign, aggressively for her team, and does she become, partisan or too partisan? Is that even possible nowadays? I don't know. But it's going to be 24 is going to be a wide open race on both sides.
Amy, weigh in on
Yeah,
this.
I so agree with Dave, because it's really easy to be
We are
rolling in the
recording,
same.
right?
I know. What'd you say?
We are recording this, right?
That's right. Look, I think what has kept Democrats in many ways so unified for the last 4 years has been they 100% agree on one thing: Donald Trump has to go, right? And so that can keep the mind and the rivalries tamped down. I mean, to me, one of the most of all the crazy things that happened in 2020, one of the things that most surprised me was to see Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar and Beto all come out right before Super Tuesday and endorse Joe Biden, right? I mean, this wasn't just like, okay, I'm dropping out, but I'm going to hold my powder and wait and see what happens with Bernie. And I didn't want to but to come in as strongly as they did, for politicians who aren't used to giving up their, shall we say, their egos are not small. That was a pretty egoless thing to do. And so I just think it to me, really drove home the point that this is really the issue in 2020. It's beating Donald Trump. It's nothing else. So now you have, as Dave pointed out, a whole bunch of folks who did give up their shot, or what they saw as their shot in 2020, but who are still young enough to want to come back in 2024. They were on the same stage with Kamala Harris. They lasted longer than Kamala Harris if you're Pete Buttigieg, if you are Amy Klobuchar, and if you're Cory Booker. There are a lot of in that category of younger folks, Gen Xers. I think we can kind of call Kamala Gen Xer. She's right there on the cusp. But I think officially we got to get my generation just to have just one shot, because we're soon going to be overtaken by millennials. So we have our one chance to get in the White House before that's over. And to the other point about the tensions, look, it is certainly where the political press corps is going to want to be, right? Looking for any sign of tension between the VP and the president. That is the story they want to be able to write. Now, this team, both at the campaign level and now even post-campaign, has been incredibly leak-free, incredibly disciplined and tight-lipped. Will it continue? Maybe it could. But as Dave says, once you start hitting those rocky shoals, bad things happen. People start to get frustrated. People feel snubbed. That's when you start to see the conversations with certain reporters or things that are just doled out, let's say, judiciously to certain people that make their way into the media landscape. So I have no doubt that will start soon. The final thing about Harris was, because this was such a weird campaign, we really didn't get to spend a lot of time on what was really a historic moment. And I think in any other time, we would have seen the convention, if we had a real convention, that would have focused so much. So, this happening on the 100th anniversary of women getting the right to vote and having a woman accepting the vice presidential nomination, I think would have had a whole lot of traction. We would have heard a lot more about that. But this was a weird election, and we'll see as we hopefully come out of the horribleness of this COVID time. Are we able to focus on anything else? I don't know. But I hope we can then kind of get back to having conversations about policy and issues instead of just the personality that we've been talking about for 4 years.
Before we get to 2024, we're going to have 2022. And obviously, a lot of what happens at the midterm will be contingent on what happens between now and then. But some of the things I think are sort of structural. Redistricting is going to take place, and some states are going to gain seats and some are going to lose seats. And within states, boundaries are going to be. We know which Senate seats are going to be on the ballot in 2022. We know which governors. So I wonder, as you look at sort of the fundamentals of the midterm election, are there things that we can observe now that are going to stand up as accurate about 2022, no matter what happens between now and then? Is the train tilted in 2022 for one party or the other?
Well, Dave and Selena pointed this out, but the fact that the state legislative races basically ended up status quo. I think Republicans picked up New Hampshire. Is that right, Dave? That was about
the House and the
yeah, but that was really it. So Democrats
maybe in Alaska, although it's still counting votes.
Oh, right. So what you have now is, basically a status quo where Republicans are kind of in the driver's seat in these states when it comes to redrawing lines. Now, we also have, since 2010, a number of ballot initiatives and legislative, new legislative proposals that were passed that changed the way redistricting happens. To it being a committee structure or trying to make it less partisan, less dependent just on the legislative makeup, but still in places like Texas, where it really is a ball game. The fact that Democrats were unable to flip the House there means that Democrats draw those lines, and Texas is getting 2 seats, maybe three, getting 3 seats, plus they are as aware of all the rest of us as what we were seeing in the suburbs in and around the Metroplex and obviously Harris County and Austin, et cetera. So they're to be able to redraw districts is going to be a big deal. I've seen estimates suggesting that Republicans could net 5 seats or more just from the redraws in the states that they do control. So that would be, that's already tilting the field in Republicans' direction. When it comes to the Senate, it's pretty, if you look at right now, what's the states that should be competitive, both sides are going to have competitive states to defend. Arizona, Mark Kelly, who just won, that he has to run again for the full term in 2022. Nevada, that is a state that Democrats have been winning pretty consistently, but by very narrow margins. And then Republicans defending Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Florida. Again, those were states that Biden won Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, but not by a whole bunch. Florida has been really frustrating for Democrats. So, this is a pretty good map. The one thing I don't, it's a pretty balanced map. The one thing I don't know is, and maybe you know this, Michael, that we traditionally think of midterms are terrible for the party in the White House. They always lose seats, blah, blah, blah. But this is if Democrats do not control the Senate. So if it's a Republican controlled Senate, We know this would be the first time since like the 1880s that a Democrat was president without control of both the House and the Senate. So does that rule still apply of losing seats, right? Like usually the reason that you lose seats in a midterm as a party in charge is you've had total control and you've sort of, voters think that you've overreached and they push you back, right? And say, no, that's too much. In this case, if it is, as we've all laid out, just kind of campaign, a process and a 2 years of just sort of incremental movement, nothing really significant. Washington still kind of in a, if not a total gridlock, at least not in the mood to move big stuff. Does that sort of temper that we got to throw out the party in the White House? I don't know, maybe.
Well, to the extent that you're right, then Democrats should be careful what they wish for in Georgia. Because if they had,
Yeah, maybe easier to govern and it better for governing, less good for politics. One thing I want to add to Amy is I think there is a real challenge for the Republicans too, in the sense that I think that we risk the ability, there's two things in off years. One is push too far and the voters push back. The other is get nothing done and the voters say, get to it. And so I think that there may also be that dynamic. Mitch McConnell thinks he's got it easy. He doesn't have it easy. If we can solve, we put up and put up and put up, and it's hard to do that from a House platform. It is easy to do that from a presidency. Here is a PPP package. It's a compromise. Let's go. And the Senate stops and the House delivers it and the Senate stops it. And then here is a small business loan or a community college loan program. These are not radical ideas in the public's mind. The House passes it, the Senate stops it. After a while, the voters may be sending a message, okay, maybe we made a mistake here with all these checks and balances. I'm going to give him a shot for his 2 years and see if we can get more of this done. So I think there's real challenges for the Republicans in governing between now and 2022.
Agree.
One last thing I wanted to put on the table before we wrap up. Dave, with your interest in state politics and Celinda, with your interest in issue, something that always gets underreported is what happens in the state ballot measures, and some really puzzling results, right? California votes for Biden overwhelmingly, but rejects a restoration of affirmative action. Florida votes for Trump, but approves a $15 minimum wage. I mean, is there anything to learn from what happens when voters actually get to say, here's what we want on a particular public policy?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to learn, and we do a lot of initiatives as a firm. And in fact, we were involved in both of those races that you're talking about. And I would say the overall pattern was, in general, that voters voted Democratic policies in. In Colorado, they protected a woman's right to choose, not in Louisiana, but in Colorado. They passed sex ed in Washington. They passed minimum wage in Florida. They passed pot everywhere they could, because if there were ever an election cycle where you might have needed a joint, it would have been this one. I think that what is interesting, there are two things that we learned. One thing that we learned is ballot language makes a big difference. The reason that we lost affirmative action in California, besides getting a late start, was ballot language. And when you're trying to pass an initiative in Western Europe, which is what California is the equivalent of, with the commensurate costs, you're really dependent on the ballot language. But in general, the lesson out of 2020, and this is why I take great heart for 2022, is that when voters could pass constrained reform that moved things forward, that's what they did. And when the language was clear, they passed those measures. And that's why I think the Republicans are under a real challenge, because the voters, they are sick and tired of getting nothing done.
Dave, I'll give you the last word, because state politics is where voters do have a chance sometimes to say yes or no to specific policies. That's where the action is on that.
Right. And I think people who love politics spend too much time trying to, fit people in the molds, or well, they voted for Biden, they voted for Trump, and they voted for this. I think voters, campaigns matter even at the proposition level. And if you have a good message and you're able to, have enough resources to get it out, and you make a cogent case that the voters will be for something or against something, depending on which side you're on. I think, the political elite generally talks in shorthand and takes for granted that, all voters vote monolithically, or, look at how many Biden and Cornyn voters there were in Texas, or the fact that, Sarah Gideon, the Speaker of the House, who ran against Susan Collins, got less votes than Donald Trump did in Maine. I mean, it's just mind-boggling that the state that he lost, where they spent $180 million to help the Speaker of the House on the Democrat side, she got less, thousands of votes less than Trump. And I just think voters look at the campaign. They're much more sophisticated than the political elite give them credit for. And I don't think they're looking, well, I have to vote the Democrat way on a proposition. I think they look at the merits of the proposition. Obviously, not all voters. Some voters just either ignore it or vote yes or whatever. But I think voters are more sophisticated now. Maybe in the olden days they weren't, but at least now, I don't think politicians treat voters, as almost like they're stupid. And I think that's a huge mistake, which is why campaigns matter. The candidate matters, the message matters, and how you conduct your campaign matters. And I don't think there's anything like a safe seat in 90% of the country. It's all about, how you put your arguments together. Well, and of course, how you try to destroy your other, your opponent's arguments. But, I think voters just vote for what they think is best for them and their families. And that's why 22 will all be determined on the economy. If the economy can get back up for everybody, not just the stock market, but people are back at work, and people are feeling good about them, they have confidence, the Democrats will have the incumbents, I guess, will have a better time getting reelected. If things are off kilter, and we don't have, people are still out of work, and no restaurants are open, and small businesses have been devastated, I think the Democrats will pay a price.
John, I see you hovering there at the edges. That tells me our time is up, although it's flown by for me.
Mike, thanks so much. And thanks to Dave, Celinda, and Amy for helping us end this year's conference on such a smart and high note. Very nice conversation. Thanks as well as to everyone else who participated in and watched the 2020 presidential elections program of the Baker Institute. We hope that it has stimulated thought and understanding about the political process that helps guide our nation. We're planning future discussions about politics and policy of our presidential elections, so please stay tuned. In the meantime, stay healthy, stay safe, and make sure that you're all registered to vote. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Made my job so easy.